The stars above the outer Virith cluster had always been cold, not just in temperature, but in feeling. They were old stars, tired stars, and for 40 years they had watched a war burn. Beneath them, a war that nobody was winning and that everyone was slowly losing. Admiral Shenvar stood at the edge of the command deck on his flagship, the Kaldor, warship Thorn of the Deep, and stared at the latest battle report. His yellow eyes moved across the numbers. Slowly, he had read reports like this many times before, but this one was different. This one told him that the Kaldor, his people, the greatest warriors in the known galaxy, had lost another 3 battalions in a single night. Not to a clever trap, not to a better weapon, just to numbers, just to the Vreth coming and coming in, coming like water through a broken dam. The Vreth Dominion was not a civilization in the way most species understood that word. They were a hive, a mass, a living machine built for one thing: expansion. They ate planets the way fire eats wood, hungrily and without thinking. Their soldiers had no names, their commanders had no mercy, and their queen, buried somewhere deep in the core system, simply kept producing more and more troops, sending them outward in endless waves. When you killed 10 Vreth, 20 more came. When you killed 1,000, 10,000 followed. For 40 years, the Galactic Conclave had been trying to stop them. 7 species had joined together. The reptilian Kaldor, the tall and ancient Talvine, the Morokai with their 4 arms, the Dash who breathed methane, the Sul who communicated only in color, the Biran who had given up their home world 6 years ago, and the Ashari whose math had built half the fleet. 7 species, hundreds of warships, billions of soldiers, and still the Vreth kept coming. Shenvar pulled up a map on the central display. Red marked Vreth-controlled space. 6 years ago, the red had taken up a third of the map. Now it covered nearly half. Every month another system fell. Every month another refugee fleet arrived at whatever safe station was still left, full of creatures who had lost everything. He had not slept in 3 days. He was not sure it would help if he did. The meeting of the Conclave Council was held on Station Vigil 9, a massive structure built at the intersection of 3 safe trade routes. It was one of the few places in the galaxy that could still be called neutral ground. 7 species sat in 7 curved sections of a large circular room. The room smelled of several different atmospheres filtered through clever environmental systems. The lighting was adjusted so that every species could see clearly. It was, in every technical way, a perfect meeting room. But the meeting itself was not perfect at all. "We cannot continue on this path," said Elder Voss of the Thaldine, her long fingers folded together on the table in front of her. She was over 300 years old, and she had personally overseen 40 years of this war. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. "We have lost 6 systems in the last 4 months. The Baron have already lost their home world. The Morokai primary colony is now surrounded. I do not say these things to frighten you. I say them because we must face what is true." No one in the room argued with her. There was nothing to argue about. Shenvar spoke next. He was not a politician, and his words were not soft. "We need something different," he said. "We have tried everything we know. We have tried defensive lines, and the Vreth broke them. We have tried targeted strikes at the breeding colonies, and the Vreth simply built more. We have tried cutting their supply routes, and they adapted within a month. He paused and looked around the room. We need a different kind of soldier, a different kind of war. The room went quiet. It was Delegate Heron of the Ashari who finally said what several of them had already been thinking. He pulled up a file on the shared display, a file that had been sitting mostly untouched in the Conclave's database for over a decade. There is one species we have not approached, he said. One that has not been part of this war. The image appeared on the display. A planet third from a yellow star, mostly blue and green, modest size, no particularly impressive natural features. Its inhabitants were two-legged, warm-blooded with soft skin and relatively short lifespans. They had only reached the stars 200 years ago. Barely a moment in galactic terms. Most conclave species had dismissed them years ago as too primitive, too young, and too emotionally unstable to be useful in a serious conflict. The species was called human. Their planet was called Earth. They have no hive mind, said Delegate Mara of the Sul, her skin flickering yellow for skepticism. They operate as individuals, their internal conflicts. They fight each other constantly. Their history is full of wars among themselves. How would they survive even one engagement with the Vreth? They have survived every engagement among themselves, said Heron quietly, for thousands of years, and they are still here. The room went quiet again. Elder Voss reached into her robe and placed a small data chip on the table. Before we vote, she said, I want to share something. 80 years ago, my species had a brief and difficult encounter with a small human exploration vessel that wandered into a system we claimed. There was a misunderstanding. There was a confrontation. She paused. Our ship was larger, better armed and crewed by veteran soldiers. The human ship was crewed by 12 people, including their commander. Another pause. We did not win that confrontation. She let that sit for a moment. When our surviving crew were asked what happened, they all said the same thing. They said the humans did not respond to the situation the way any intelligent creature should. They said the humans seemed to become more focused, more dangerous, more determined as the situation got worse. Not less, one of my crew wrote in her final report. Do not let them smell blood. You will not recognize what answers you. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a joke. Room was very still. The vote was taken. It was close. 4 in favor, 3 against, with significant concerns registered from all sides. But it passed. The conclave would send a distress beacon to Earth. They would ask the humans for help. They would offer resources, alliance, and territory in exchange for military support. Shenvar left the meeting and went directly to his ship. He stood again at the command deck, looking out at the stars and thought about what they had just done. He had called for reinforcements. He spent 40 years in this war, and he had finally admitted that his people alone could not finish it. 6 hours later, the response came back from Earth. It was not a diplomatic reply. It was not a request for more information or a counter-proposal or a list of demands. It was a single short transmission from something called the Unified Earth Command, and it said only this: acknowledged. Fleet 7 is already moving, General. Vasquez will meet you at Station Vidal 9. In 4 days. Shenvar read the message twice. 4 days, Fleet 7 was already moving. They had not waited for permission, they had not asked for clarification, they had simply begun. He thought again about Elder Voss's words: do not let them smell blood, you will not recognize what answers you. He stared at the message for a long time, then he went to get what sleep he could. Nobody on Station Vigil 9 was ready for what arrived. The human fleet came in fast, far faster than standard arrival protocol allowed. Conclave docking control had barely finished sending the welcome signal when the first ship cleared the jump point. Then another, then 6 more, then a dozen. They did not slow down gracefully, the way Conclave ships did, dropping speed over the course of an hour in careful, measured steps. They braked hard and late, like creatures used to arriving in places where every second mattered. Shenvar watched from the observation deck as the human ships took their positions in the docking formation. His first thought was that they were old, not ancient, not the way Thavine ships were ancient but worn. These were vessels that had seen a great deal of use. Their hulls were patched and repatched. One of the larger ships had what looked like a section of entirely different colored plating along its lower hull, clearly replaced after some kind of significant damage. Smaller escort ship had scorch marks near its main thruster array that had never been fully buffed away. His second thought was that they were wrong in a way he could not immediately name. Then it came to him. Every Conclave warship in the galaxy was designed with a mix of offensive and defensive features: heavy shields, good armor, solid weapons, adequate speed. Balance was considered wisdom. These human ships were not balanced. They were built almost entirely for offense. Fewer shield arrays than he would expect, lighter armor than any Kaldor vessel would carry, but weapons everywhere. Hard points on angles that made no defensive sense. Launch bays that could deploy an enormous number of strike craft in a very short time. These were not ships built to survive being hit. These were ships built to hit. First, hit hard and end the fight before the other side could hit back. Shenvar was not sure whether to be encouraged or disturbed. He decided both was probably the right answer. General Mara Vasquez arrived at the station 3 hours after her fleet docked. She came with a small group, 4 other humans in military uniform, and one who appeared to be a communications officer. Shenvar had studied human physical characteristics in preparation for this meeting, but seeing one in person was different. They were smaller than he had expected. The general barely reached his shoulder, and Shenvar was not considered tall even among the Kaldor. She had dark hair cut close to her head, brown skin that showed a few old scars, and eyes that were the color of deep soil after rain. She walked without ceremony, looked around the docking bay with the focused attention of someone cataloging details, and extended one hand toward him. He shook it, remembering the gesture from his research. Her grip was firmer than he expected. "Admiral Shenvar," she said. Her voice was lower than he had imagined. A human voice would be calm, not unfriendly, but not warm either. It was the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago to keep their tone level in rooms full of uncertainty. "General Vasquez," he replied, "welcome. We are grateful." "Thank you," she said, cutting him off without rudeness. "Just Efficiency. I'd like to get to the briefing room as soon as possible. I have 3 questions and then we can talk. Strategy. They walked to the main briefing room. Together, the full conclave council was not present. This was a military meeting, not a political one. Shenvar, his 2 senior officers, and the Morkai fleet commander Wrath were the conclave side. Vasquez sat down, placed a thin portable unit on the table, and looked around at each of them in turn. Then she asked her 3 questions. Where are the Wraith breeding colonies? Shenvar pulled up the map. There are 11 confirmed major breeding sites. 3 of them are in heavily fortified systems. The others are I'll need the full data package. That's fine, she nodded once. Second question, what's the maximum Wraith concentration point right now? Where are most of them gathered? Wrath answered that one, the Ket's system, a moon called Ket's Hollow. We estimate 4 million ground troops and significant orbital defenses. It functions as both a staging ground and a munitions production site. Vasquez wrote something on her unit. Third question, who do we talk to about rules of engagement, or is there nobody to talk to? The room went quiet for just a moment. Shenvar answered carefully, the Vreth do not recognize any form of treaty or agreement. They have never taken prisoners. They do not distinguish between military and civilian targets. There are no rules, General. She nodded again, and he thought he saw something in her expression change. Not pleasure exactly, but something close to resolution, like a door closing. Good, she said, simpler that way. A Kaldar officer named Dorith was assigned as the official liaison between the Conclave forces and the human fleet. He moved into the human flagship, a carrier called the Steadfast Wound, a name that Dorith thought was either very strange or deeply poetic, and after 2 days aboard he had decided it was probably both. He sent daily reports back to Shenvar. The first few were straightforward. The humans were efficient, organized, and professional. Their equipment was well maintained despite its worn appearance. Their training exercises were relentless. But by the 4th day, his reports began to change. They laugh before battles, he wrote, not in a disturbed way, in a way that seems to release tension. Their humor is often dark, jokes about death, about injury, about things going wrong. I have been told this is normal for them and that it actually indicates good morale. I'm not sure I understand this, but I am reporting it. They name their weapons, read another report, individual weapons. One soldier showed me her rifle and told me its name. She said it was important. I asked why, and she seemed to have difficulty explaining. She said, because then it knows what it's for. I have been thinking about this for 2 days, and I am still not certain what to make of it. They keep photographs, he wrote later, inside their armor near their hearts. I asked one of them about it, a young man named Tors. He showed me the photo. It was his family, his parents, a sibling, 2 small children, he said. That's why I'm here. I did not know what to say to that. Among the Kaldar, we go to war because we are soldiers, and that is our function. We fight for the Conclave, for civilization, for survival. We do not. I am having difficulty finding the right word. We do not fight for people in the specific sense that these humans seem to. It is different. I'm not yet sure if it is stronger or simply different. His final report before the first operation was the shortest and the one Shenvar read 3 times. I've been trying to find the right word for what I observe in them when they prepare for combat. I thought at first it was bravery, but bravery is something you perform in spite of fear. I do not believe they have conquered their fear. I believe they have done something stranger. They have taken fear and changed what it does to them. In most species, fear slows. In humans, it appears to accelerate. They become sharper, not duller, more present, not less. They do not become calm. I have seen their hands shake. I have seen them breathe hard. I have seen them close their eyes for just a moment before in action. But then they move. They always move. Whatever fear does to the rest of us, in them it appears to be load-bearing. I do not have a better way to say this. I am watching something I do not yet have a word for. On the 5th day, Vasquez called the joint planning meeting. Shenvar expected her to present a support role for the human forces. Perhaps they would take a flank position or secure a secondary objective while the Kaldor handled the main advance. She slid a battle map across the table. The human forces were positioned in the center of the assault formation, not the flank. The center, General, he said. Carefully, the center approach at Katsello means going directly through the primary orbital defense grid. Vreth will focus everything there. Yes, she said, the casualties would be manageable if we move fast enough, she said, and we will move fast enough. She looked at him with those soiled dark eyes. Admiral, I did not come here to stand at the edge and watch. Tell me if you disagree with the plan and we'll talk it through. But do not tell me it's dangerous. I know it's dangerous. That not a reason. Shenvar looked at her for a long moment, then he looked back at the map. The moon of Katsello looked peaceful from a distance, pale gray, wrapped in thin brown clouds, orbiting a gas giant so large it filled a quarter of the sky. It did not look like a place where 4 million soldiers waited in underground tunnels and surface bunkers ready to kill anything that moved. It did not look like the hardest target in the known galaxy. It did not look like many things, but it was. Shenvar stood on the bridge of the Thorn of the Deep and watched the assault begin. The human ships went first. That had been agreed upon, not because anyone had asked the humans to go first, but because Vasquez had simply drawn the attack vector on the map and put her fleet at the point of it, and nobody had successfully argued her out of it. The Vreth orbital defense grid opened up the moment that the ships were in range. It was a significant grid, hundreds of automated cannons, missile banks, and point defense systems layered over the moon like a shell. Every conclave military analyst had studied it. The accepted wisdom was that no fleet could punch through it without sacrificing at least 60% of their ships. At 60% losses, the remaining force would not be strong enough to support a ground operation. That was why Ket's Hollow had been considered impossible to take. The humans did not seem to have received that analysis. They went in without slowing down. Their ships absorbed fire. Shenvar watched one of the carrier's escort vessels take 3 direct hits in quick succession, its shields failing on the second, its outer plating cracking on the third. It kept moving. It kept firing its own weapons, poured fire back into the grid with extraordinary speed and precision, targeting the anti-air platforms in a sequence Shenvar recognized as a Specific human tactic. They were not firing randomly. They were cutting lanes, narrow paths through the defense grid through which their drop ships could descend. A burning human transport ship took a catastrophic hit to its port engines and began to fall out of formation. Shenvar's chest tightened. There were soldiers on that ship, hundreds of them. And the ship was going too. But it did not go down, it's remaining. Engines fired harder, it fell slightly behind the line but continued moving forward, angling its burning side toward the incoming fire, using its own wreckage as a shield for the two drop ships flying directly behind it. He watched it keep going until it was below the primary defense layer and then begin its descent, trailing smoke and fire, its pilot somehow still in control. Doreth, standing beside him, said nothing. His face said everything. The lanes opened, the drop ships fell through. Ground combat on Kes Hollow was supposed to be the second impossible thing about taking it. The Vreth had tunneled extensively beneath the surface, a network of passages that allowed them to move troops quickly from any point to any other, appearing and disappearing in ways that made traditional frontline combat meaningless. You could push them back in one area, and they would surface behind you. You could hold a position, and they would tunnel under it. The Kaldor had tried this kind of fighting before. It was exhausting and slow and costly. The humans did not fight like the Kaldor. They did not try to hold lines. Doreth followed the ground combat on the tactical display, watching the human companies move in ways that had no pattern he could predict. They spread out, then compressed, then split, then rejoined. They moved fast, often faster than the Vreth tunnels could redirect troops. When the Vreth surfaced in their rear, the humans turned and engaged without retreating. When they were surrounded, they did not stop. That was the thing that stayed with Doreth longest afterward, the surrounded companies. At approximately the 4th hour of the ground assault, a Vreth shock swarm of 10,000 units came up from 6 separate tunnel exits and surrounded a human company of 300 Marines. Doreth watched it happen on the display. He watched the circle close, 300 humans, 10,000 Vreth. He had seen the Kaldor, his own people, the greatest warriors in the conclave, broken by worse odds than this. He had seen what happened to surrounded soldiers. He began composing a casualty estimate. In his head, not dead. There was still signal. Just quiet. For 11 seconds, then Sergeant Akafer's voice came through, steady and almost amused. All right, they've got us surrounded. Poor bastards. And the 300 Marines attacked outward, not retreating toward a gap, not holding a perimeter. Outward in all directions at once, splitting into small groups that each hit a different part of the encircling Vreth mass simultaneously, moving through the enemy formation, rather than defending against it. They used the Vreth's own tunnels, they used the terrain, they used angles and timing and a ferocity that the Vreth, for all their numbers and their biological fearlessness, had simply never encountered before, because the Vreth had never fought something that responded to being surrounded by deciding to be the thing doing the surrounding. It took 40 minutes. When it was over, the 300 were down to 219. But there were no Vreth left from that shock swarm, not one. The battle for the surface installations lasted another 15 Hours, the battle for the underground complex lasted 12 after that. Human forces never stopped moving. When one unit was too depleted to continue, another rotated through. When a tunnel collapsed on a squad and trapped them, the next squad went in. After them, even before the dust settled. Dorov watched medical staff treat wounded soldiers who then returned to combat before Dorov had fully processed that they had been wounded. He sent Shenvar a short message during the 15th hour. I do not think they know how to stop. Cat's Hollow fell in 31 hours. Every conclave projection, using every model they had estimated a minimum of 4 months, and those projections had assumed it was achievable at all, which most of them had not. Dorov found Vasquez at the edge of a large crater near what had been the main Vret surface command post. She was standing still, which was unusual enough that he noted it. She was looking out across the broken gray landscape at the smoke still rising from 3 different locations, at the distant curve of the gas giant above the horizon. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been in motion for so long that stillness felt strange. He walked up beside her. He was not sure what to say. He settled on something honest. How do you feel? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, hungry. She glanced at him sideways. What's next on the list? He stared at her. He tried to find something in her face. Exhaustion, relief, grief for the soldiers lost something. There was something there, he thought. Something behind her eyes that was not nothing. But it was not what he expected, and it did not look anything like what he would have felt after 31 hours of that. He went back to his quarters on the steadfast wound and wrote the longest report he had filed since arriving. He described the orbital approach, the burning transport that had not stopped, the surrounded company that had attacked, outward the medical staff returning, soldiers to combat, all of it. Then he sat for a while before writing the final paragraph. I came here believing that the humans might be useful, he wrote, useful the way a tool is useful, functional, reliable, good for a specific task. I was wrong about what kind of thing they are. A tool does not choose, a tool does not adapt, a tool does not turn to the thing that is trying to break it and decide to break back instead. I have spent 31 hours watching them fight, and I have come to believe that everything the Conclave thought it knew about the limits of what a soldier can be was based on never having seen one of these. He sent the report, then he heard someone laughing in the corridor. Outside, deep, tired laughter, the kind that comes after something hard is finally over. Human laughter. He sat with that sound for a long time. News of Kes Hollow reached the rest of the galaxy in stages, and each stage produced a different reaction. The Conclave fleet commanders heard it first in hard numbers. 31 hours, 1 fortified moon, 4 million. Vreth troops neutralized, and the human casualties were significant, but the operation was considered, by any military metric, a complete success. The commanders were quiet for a long time when they received that report. Some of them pulled up their old projections and looked at the 4-month estimate again. A Morkai admiral named Serac crumpled her copy into a ball, which was the Morkai equivalent of a very long and profane statement of disbelief. The Conclave civilian councils heard it. Second, their reaction was more complicated. Release came first because relief always comes first when something that was supposed to be impossible turns out to be possible. But relief was quickly followed by a different feeling, a colder feeling, the kind that comes when you realize you have invited something very powerful into your home and you do not fully understand what it wants. The rest of the galaxy heard it third, in fragments and rumors, and what reached them was already becoming a story, not just a military report, a story, the burning ship that would not fall, the 300 who attacked 10,000, the moon that was supposed to take 4 months and fell in a day and a half. Stories travel fast when they contain something people find both amazing and frightening. In the Conclave archives, an old historian named Fail of the Thavine, 340 years old, which even for his long-lived species was quite old, pulled up a collection of records that had not been accessed in over a decade. He had compiled these records himself many years ago out of a private curiosity that nobody had shared at the time. They were accounts of human contact from across the galaxy. 43 separate species had some record of encountering humans. Most of the encounters were brief. Many of them had involved some degree of conflict. The pattern was always the same. Humans were encountered. Humans were assessed. Humans were considered manageable. Then the assessment changed. Fail read through account after account. A drawl survey team that had tried to claim a system where a small human colony had already established itself. The drawl were larger, had better weapons, and outnumbered the humans 8-1. They left the system after 3 days and the colony was still there. A Vethian traders guild that had attempted to manipulate the price of a human-produced resource by using their ships to blockade a transit point. The guild had extensive experience with this kind of economic pressure. The humans had responded by finding a different route, producing more of the resource, and then Fail smiled slightly, reading this part, by systematically buying controlling shares in 4 of the guild's primary partner companies over the next decade until the guild agreed to new terms. A group of pirates of mixed species who had decided that a human passenger liner was an easy target. They were never heard from again. He compiled his findings into a report titled On the Domesticated Predator, Humanity and the Illusion of Civilization. He sent it to the council with a note that said, I am not suggesting we made a mistake. I am suggesting we understand what we invited. In Vret space, something unprecedented was happening. The Vret had no individual commanders in the way other species understood command. The hive mind simply distributed tactical instructions and units executed them. But the hive mind was an intelligence, a vast, ancient, distributed intelligence, and it processed information. It learned, it adapted. That was part of what made it so dangerous. It had been adapting and learning for longer than most conclave species had been flying between stars. After Keth's Hollow, the hive mind did something it had never in its recorded history been observed to do. It hesitated. Its tactical systems registered the new combatant class that had appeared in the war, the ones the hive mind's language centers had no existing word for, because its language had no category for something like this. It spent processing cycles generating new classification, the translation. When conclave intelligence eventually decoded it from intercepted signals, came out roughly as creatures that do not acknowledge the signal to stop. Every species the Vret had ever fought had a limit, a point of sufficient loss, or sufficient threat at which they stopped pressing forward. The limit was different for each species. Some reached it sooner, some later, but it always existed. It was a law of things like gravity. The hive mind had learned to find those limits and push past them. Find the breaking point, apply the right pressure, and the enemy stops. The humans appeared to have a different relationship with that law. On the flagship Steadfast Wound, Doreth spent several evenings walking the corridors and observing. He had been a soldier and a scholar in roughly equal measure his whole life, and both parts of him were fully engaged now in trying to understand what he was seeing. One evening he passed an open bunk room and saw something that stopped him in the doorway. A young soldier, barely 22 years old by human counting, he knew from the roster, was sitting at a small desk with a piece of actual paper in front of her. She was writing by hand. Her face was wet. She was crying with the specific quiet of someone who had learned how to cry without making noise because there were other people sleeping nearby. He recognized the behavior. She was writing letters to the families of the people she had lost. He had read enough about human customs to know this was something they did. He started to move on to give her privacy. Then she finished. She folded the letters carefully. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She stood up, took 3 slow breaths, put on her armor, and walked out of the room toward the briefing bay where the next mission was being planned. Doreth stood in the empty doorway for a long time afterward. He had seen grief stop soldiers before. He had seen it take people out of a fight for hours, for days, sometimes permanently. Grief was a wound, and wounds needed time. That was true for every species he had encountered. It was one of the constants of intelligent life. But this soldier had grieved and then stood up. Not because the grief was over. He did not think it was over. He thought she carried it with her. He thought it was inside the armor along with the photograph. He went to his quarters and wrote in his report, "Among the Kaldor, grief stops us. It is a heavy thing and it sits on us until it lightens on its own. In humans, something else happens. They carry the grief with them into the next thing. It does not appear to make them weaker. I am beginning to think it makes them something else entirely, something I do not have a word for yet." Meanwhile, back on Station Vigil 9, the Conclave Council held a session that was not on any official schedule. There was only one question on the agenda: should the Council ask the humans to halt their offensive once the Vreth were driven back to their core systems? The reasoning behind the question was not complicated. The war was turning. Since Cat's Hollow, 3 more strategic Vreth positions had fallen. The human fleet was moving consistently forward, and the Conclave forces fighting alongside them were performing better than they had in years, partly because of tactical coordination, and partly because watching the humans fight appeared to do something to the other species' sense of what was possible, something that might be described as a reminder. But the question was, once the Vreth were pushed back far enough to no longer be an existential threat, would the humans stop? Would they want to keep going? Did anyone have the ability to make them stop if they chose not to? The vote was called 4 in favor of requesting a halt, 3 against, but one of the 4 then abstained, citing insufficient information, and the vote tied. The deciding vote belonged to Shenvar. Before he cast it, he requested a private meeting with Vasquez. They met in a small room off the main corridor of the station. She stood, he sat. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You want to know if we'll stop when the threat is gone? Yes, he said. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, we'll stop when you ask. Us two, we're not them. A pause. But you should know something, Admiral. Your people called us and we came. That means something to us. We protect what's ours now. Your people are ours now. That doesn't have an off switch. He looked at her for a long time. He thought about the burning ship that would not fall. He thought about the soldier with the letters in the armor. He went back to the council and cast his vote. Vreth Prime was the oldest place in the Dominion. Most species did not know this because the Vreth did not have history the way other species did. No written records, no monuments, no stories passed down through generations. But the planet itself held its age in its rocks and in the deep tunnels that ran beneath its surface like the roots of something impossibly old. The Queen had lived there for longer than any conclave species had been. Flying ships. She had watched empires form and collapse at the edges of her territory. She had absorbed 12 other species into her dominion, and she had outlasted every threat that had come against her. She had never in all of that time been afraid. The assault fleet entered the Vreth Prime system in 2 waves. The Conclave forces Kaeldar, Morkai, Thavin, and the others formed the outer ring, taking on the Vreth defensive positions that surrounded the planet in layer after layer. The human fleet took the inside line, driving directly toward the planet itself, absorbing everything the Dominion had left and continuing forward. The losses were the highest of the war. Shenvar stood on his bridge and watched ships die, conclave ships and human ships, both bright flashes in the dark, that had been crewed by people he had known. He did not look away. He had learned, watching the humans these past months, that looking away was not respect. Respect was witnessing the human dropships hit the atmosphere of Vreth Prime in the early hours of what the planet's slow rotation made into something like a morning. The ground battle was the worst thing Dorath had ever seen, and he had spent 3 years at the front before all of this. The Vreth on their home planet fought with a desperation that none of their other troops had ever shown, not because they were capable of fear, but because the Queen was feeding them something through the hive mind, some signal, some instruction that translated in their bodies into absolute resistance. They did not retreat, they did not surrender, they had to be removed from every position individually, meter by meter. Human casualties climbed steadily. Dorath watched the numbers update in real time on the tactical display and felt something cold settle in his chest. There were soldiers on that planet he had eaten meals with, traded bad jokes with, watched write letters by lamplight. He watched the numbers and told himself they knew what they were doing. He told himself Vashka knew what she was doing. He was right about both things, and it helped less than he hoped. The final push toward the Queen's chamber took 11 hours. When the human advance units broke through the last tunnel barrier and entered the central structure, a vast underground space that had been carved over centuries, its walls covered in patterns that the Queen had grown. They're the way trees grow rings. The transmission came. It went out to every ship in the system, simultaneously, in every language the Queen had ever encountered, translate by whatever deep intelligence lived inside the hive mind and had been processing language inputs for longer than civilization had existed in most places. It said, "What are you?" The question was not fearful, it was not a plea, it was the genuine inquiry of something very old that had for the first time encountered something it genuinely did not understand. Vasquez received the transmission on the bridge of the steadfast wound. She stood at the communications array for a moment looking at it. Then she opened a channel, not just to the Queen but to every ship in the fleet, conclave and human alike. She wanted them to hear this. She had thought about what she would say if this moment came, and she had decided not to think about it too much, because the things that were most true were usually the things you did not have to plan. She said, "We are the ones you made the mistake of threatening first." The Queen was silent for a long time. Then her chamber was breached and the war ended. There was a moment after the silence confirmed the Queen's death when the hive mind, that vast distributed intelligence that had linked every Vreth soldier on every planet in the Dominion, flickered. It did not die immediately. It took several hours for the network to fail. In those hours, Vreth soldiers across dozens of systems simply stopped. They did not run, they did not fight. They stood where they were, disconnected from the thing that had told them what to be. And they were, perhaps for the first time in their existence, alone, standing in the ruins of the Queen's chamber, surrounded by her advance team. Vasquez looked at the Vreth soldiers who had been guarding the final corridor. They were still standing, not attacking, not fleeing, just standing, swaying slightly like trees in a wind that had stopped. One of her soldiers raised a weapon. "Stand down," she said. The soldier looked at her. "General, stand down," she said again. Her voice was quiet and flat and not a question. The soldier lowered the weapon. There had been voices among the human fleet and among some parts of the conclave that had wanted Vreth Prime destroyed entirely. Remove the homeworld, remove the symbolic center of the Dominion, ensure that nothing could ever rebuild from this origin point. It was not an unreasonable argument, but Vasquez had thought about it and arrived somewhere different. "We end wars," she said to her team, to the record, to whoever was listening. "We don't become what we fought." Those words traveled far. Doreth recorded them in his report that evening, and years later they would appear in history texts, in diplomatic documents, in the speeches of leaders who needed to explain to their people the difference between winning and becoming the enemy. The Vreth Dominion did not end overnight. Systems had to be secured. Holdout groups had to be contained. The political work of dealing with what to do with the surviving Vreth population, disconnected from their Queen, no longer a conquering force, but also no longer capable of functioning as a society, would take years, and it was hard, grinding, complicated work. There were arguments and failures and things that went wrong in the rebuilding. But the war itself was over. 1 year later, Doreth published his definitive academic work on humanity. It was the most read document in the conclave that year and for several years. After it was not long, he had resisted the temptation to make it longer than it needed to be. The conclusion read, "We searched for monsters in the dark and found only enemies. We called for help and found something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than anything the Vreth ever were, a predator that had learned mercy. Not because it was weak, because it was strong enough to choose. I have spent 2 years among them, watching them fight, watching them grieve, watching them laugh at terrible things and carry their dead with them into the next battle. I have come to believe that the most important thing to understand about humans is not their strength or their endurance or their adaptability, though all of those things are real and remarkable. The most important thing is that they made a choice somewhere in their long and violent history to use all of those things in the service of something other than conquest. They are the most dangerous species I have ever encountered, and the only reason the rest of us are safe is that they decided we were worth protecting. I do not think we should ever let ourselves forget how thin that line is, nor should we forget even for a moment how lucky we are to be standing on the right side of it." Vasquez retired to Earth 8 months after the war ended. She planted things in a garden. She learned to sleep again, which took longer than she expected. She did not talk much about the war except occasionally with the people who had been in it, and even then not much. 2 years after the armistice, a young Kaldor diplomat came to visit her. She was Dora's daughter. She had her father's eyes, calm and careful, always looking for the detail that other people missed. She had traveled a long way to deliver a formal document from the Conclave Council. Vasquez read it sitting in the garden. She took her time. The document was an official invitation for humanity to join the Galactic Conclave as a full member. Not an allied species, not a contracted military partner, voting rights, representation, full participation. The civilization they had helped to save. She folded the document carefully and looked at Dorit's daughter for a long moment, then she smiled, a real smile. Not the battlefield smile that people who had served under her knew to treat as a warning, but a genuine one, the kind that reached her eyes. "We thought you'd never ask," she said.